The year is 1954, and in a drab government building in Washington, D.C., one of the most extraordinary trials of the 20th century is unfolding. Behind closed doors, the man sitting in the defendant's chair is not a traitor, not a spy, not an enemy agent. He is Robert Oppenheimer, the brilliant physicist who just 9 years earlier had been celebrated as the father of the atomic bomb, the scientific genius who had led the Manhattan Project and helped America win World War II. Now, this same man sits accused of being a security risk, his loyalty questioned, his past associations scrutinized, his every action and statement examined for evidence of disloyalty to the nation he had served so well. How did the hero of 1945 become the suspect of 1954? How did America's most important scientist transform into someone the government considered a potential threat to national security? This is the complex, troubling, and ultimately tragic story of how Cold War paranoia, political revenge, scientific disagreements, and past associations combined to destroy the reputation of one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century. To understand how Oppenheimer became viewed as a threat, we must first understand the dramatic transformation of the world between 1945 and 1954, when World War II ended with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. America stood as the sole possessor of nuclear weapons, a position of unprecedented power in human history. The Soviet Union, though victorious over Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front, had suffered catastrophic losses and emerged from the war economically devastated. American policymakers believed they had years, perhaps even a decade or more, before the Soviets could develop their own atomic bomb. This nuclear monopoly gave the United States enormous leverage in shaping the post-war world, and many in the government wanted to maintain that monopoly for as long as possible. But Oppenheimer, along with many of the scientists who had built the atomic bomb, had a different vision. They understood better than anyone the physics underlying nuclear weapons, and they knew that the secrets of the atomic bomb were not really secrets at all. The basic principles were known to physicists around the world. It was only the specific engineering details and the enormous industrial capacity required to produce fissile material that had given America its temporary advantage. Oppenheimer believed that trying to maintain a nuclear monopoly through secrecy was both futile and dangerous. He advocated instead for international control of atomic energy, for sharing scientific knowledge under appropriate safeguards, for creating systems that would prevent a nuclear arms race before it could begin. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Oppenheimer threw himself into these debates with the same intensity he had brought to building the bomb. He was appointed to the General Advisory Committee of the newly created Atomic Energy Commission, and in 1947 he became the chairman of this influential body. He advised presidents and congressmen, testified before committees, wrote articles, and gave speeches about the implications of atomic weapons. He warned, with an eloquence that came naturally to his literary and philosophical mind, that humanity now possessed the power to destroy itself, and that the competition between nations to build ever more destructive weapons would lead inevitably to catastrophe. He spoke of atomic bombs as a weapon for aggressors, suggesting that their primary value was in attacking cities rather than defending territory, and he questioned whether building more and more of these weapons actually increased American security or simply made the world more dangerous for everyone. These views, perfectly reasonable from a scientific and humanitarian perspective, began to put Oppenheimer at odds with powerful forces in the American government and military establishment. As relations between the United States and Soviet Union deteriorated into what would become known as the Cold War, many political leaders saw Oppenheimer's advocacy for international control and his warnings about an arms race as naive at best and dangerous at worst. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, was expanding its control over Eastern Europe, supporting communist movements around the world, and presenting itself as the ideological opponent of American capitalism and democracy. In this context, calls for sharing atomic secrets or limiting America's nuclear arsenal seemed to many like a betrayal of American interests. The tension between Oppenheimer's views and government policy intensified as the late 1940s progressed. In 1949, two events shocked America and fundamentally altered the Cold War landscape. In August, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. Years ahead of American predictions, the nuclear monopoly was over, and suddenly the United States faced the possibility of nuclear attack. Then, in October, Mao Zedong's communist forces won the Chinese Civil War, and the world's most populous nation fell under communist control. These twin shocks triggered a wave of fear and paranoia in America. How had the Soviets built a bomb so quickly? Were there spies in the Manhattan Project? Who had betrayed atomic secrets to the enemy? The search for answers would lead to accusations, investigations, and a climate of suspicion that would eventually engulf Oppenheimer himself. The revelation that there had indeed been Soviet spies in the Manhattan Project added fuel to these fires. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who had worked at Los Alamos, was arrested in 1950 and confessed to passing detailed information about the atomic bomb to Soviet agents. His espionage had genuinely helped the Soviet program, though exactly how much remained debatable. The arrest of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, on charges of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets, created a sensation and fed the growing conviction that America was riddled with communist agents and sympathizers who were undermining national security. In this atmosphere of fear and suspicion, anyone with past associations with communists or left-wing causes became suspect, and Oppenheimer's past was filled with exactly such associations. During the 1930s, before the Manhattan Project, before World War II, before anyone could have imagined that theoretical physicists would become central to national security, Oppenheimer had moved in decidedly left-wing circles. This was not unusual for intellectuals of his generation. The Great Depression had radicalized many thoughtful people, and the rise of fascism in Europe had driven many into alliances with communist and socialist movements that presented themselves as the only effective opposition to Hitler and Mussolini. Oppenheimer had donated money to various left-wing causes, including organizations that were later identified as communist front groups. His brother Frank was an actual member of the Communist Party. His girlfriend Jean Tatlock, whom he had been deeply involved with in the late 1930s, was a Communist Party member. His wife Kitty had been married to a communist who died fighting fascists in the Spanish Civil War. Several of his closest friends and associates at Berkeley had been communists or communist sympathizers. Oppenheimer himself always denied being a member of the Communist Party, and no evidence has ever emerged that definitively proves otherwise. But he had certainly been what later investigators would call a fellow traveler, someone who sympathized with communist causes even if not formally a party member. He had attended meetings of communist-associated groups, had hosted fundraisers for leftist causes at his home, had maintained relationships with people who were active communists. All of this was known to Army intelligence when Oppenheimer was appointed to lead Los Alamos in 1942, and General Groves had made the decision to overlook these associations because Oppenheimer's scientific brilliance was irreplaceable. During the war, when defeating Nazi Germany was the overriding priority and the Soviet Union was America's ally, Oppenheimer's left-wing past seemed like a relatively minor concern. But in the Cold War atmosphere of the early 1950s, these same associations took on a much more sinister cast. The man who had once been given the benefit of the doubt because his services were essential now found that his every past action was being re-examined through a lens of suspicion. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had ordered extensive surveillance of Oppenheimer, with agents monitoring his movements, tapping his phones, reading his mail, and compiling a massive file on his activities and associations. The FBI file on Oppenheimer eventually grew to thousands of pages, documenting his contacts, recording his conversations, and painting a picture of a man whose loyalty to America was, in Hoover's view, questionable at best. Yet even with all this surveillance and suspicion, Oppenheimer might have escaped serious consequences if not for the most controversial debate of the early Cold War, whether America should build the hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb, also called a thermonuclear weapon or super, was a weapon based on nuclear fusion, rather than fission, potentially capable of explosive yields hundreds or even thousands of times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. The basic concept had been discussed during the Manhattan Project, with the brilliant and eccentric physicist Edward Teller serving as the super's most enthusiastic advocate. But during the war, the focus had been on building fission bombs, and the super had remained a theoretical possibility rather than an active program. After the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, pressure mounted to accelerate work on the hydrogen bomb. Many scientists, military leaders, and politicians argued that if the Soviets were going to develop thermonuclear weapons, America needed to develop them first to maintain nuclear superiority. Edward Teller pushed aggressively for a crash program to build the super, arguing that it was technically feasible and strategically necessary. But Oppenheimer, in his role as chairman of the General Advisory Committee, opposed a crash program to develop the hydrogen bomb, and his opposition would become the central issue in his eventual downfall. The General Advisory Committee met in October 1949 to consider the hydrogen bomb question, and after extensive deliberations, they issued a report opposing a crash program to build the weapon. The report had two annexes, one signed by Oppenheimer and several other committee members, and another by committee members Enrico Fermi and Isidore Rabi. Both annexes opposed the hydrogen bomb, but on different grounds. Fermi and Rabi's annex opposed it primarily on moral grounds, calling it necessarily an evil thing considered in any light, and suggesting that the United States should publicly declare it would not build such a weapon and should invite other nations to join in this restraint. Oppenheimer's annex was more technical and strategic, questioning whether the hydrogen bomb would actually enhance American security and arguing that resources would be better spent on improving and increasing the stockpile of atomic bombs and on developing tactical nuclear weapons that could be used on battlefields rather than against cities. It's crucial to understand that Oppenheimer was not opposing nuclear weapons in general. He had, after all, built the first ones. His opposition to the hydrogen bomb was based on several considerations that seemed reasonable to him and to many of his fellow scientists. First, there was genuine uncertainty about whether a hydrogen bomb was even technically feasible with current knowledge. The designs being discussed in 1949 were extremely complex and might not work at all. Second, Oppenheimer questioned whether a bomb hundreds of times more powerful than existing atomic weapons actually served any military purpose, or whether it was simply a weapon of mass genocide against civilian populations. Third, he worried that a crash program on the hydrogen bomb would divert resources and scientific talent away from other nuclear weapons projects that might be more useful. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, he feared that pursuing the hydrogen bomb would trigger an unlimited arms race with the Soviet Union, leading to a world bristling with weapons capable of destroying civilization. These arguments carried weight with some policymakers, but they ran headlong into the Cold War logic that was coming to dominate American strategic thinking. President Truman, faced with the Soviet atomic bomb and the communist victory in China, was not inclined to show restraint or to gamble that the Soviets would reciprocate any American decision not to pursue thermonuclear weapons. In January 1950, just months after the General Advisory Committee's report, Truman announced that he was directing the Atomic Energy Commission to proceed with development of the hydrogen bomb. It was a clear rejection of Oppenheimer's advice, and it marked the beginning of Oppenheimer's transformation from valued advisor to suspected obstacle. Edward Teller, who desperately wanted the hydrogen bomb program to proceed and who had clashed with Oppenheimer on numerous occasions over the years, became increasingly convinced that Oppenheimer was not just wrong, but was actively hindering American national security. Teller believed that Oppenheimer's prestige and influence had delayed the hydrogen bomb program, potentially giving the Soviets a chance to develop thermonuclear weapons first. Other scientists who had worked on the hydrogen bomb shared this view, and they began to see Oppenheimer not as a colleague with different technical and strategic judgments, but as an opponent who needed to be countered and whose influence needed to be eliminated. The situation deteriorated further when the Soviet Union successfully tested its own hydrogen bomb in August 1953. A test that shocked American officials with its sophistication and power. The United States had tested its first thermonuclear device in November 1952, but it was a massive, unwieldy contraption that could never be delivered by aircraft. The Soviet test, by contrast, appeared to be a deliverable weapon, suggesting that their hydrogen bomb program might actually be ahead of America's. This development intensified the feeling among Oppenheimer's critics that his opposition to the hydrogen bomb had been dangerously misguided and had potentially cost America valuable time in the nuclear arms race. Meanwhile, the broader political climate in America was growing, increasingly poisoned by anti-communist hysteria. Senator Joseph McCarthy was conducting his infamous investigations, accusing government officials, academics, and cultural figures of being communists or communist sympathizers, often on the basis of flimsy or non-existent evidence. The House Un-American Activities Committee was hauling witnesses before Congress to testify about their political associations and to name names of others with left-wing connections. Careers were being destroyed, reputations ruined, and lives shattered based on accusations that often amounted to nothing more than having attended a meeting or signed a petition years earlier. In this atmosphere, Oppenheimer's past associations with communists made him an obvious target, and his opposition to the hydrogen bomb gave his enemies a motive to go after him. The attack, when it came, was orchestrated and deliberate. In November 1953, William Borden, former executive director of the Congressional Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, sent a letter to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover making an extraordinary accusation. Based on his review of the evidence, Borden wrote, it was his conclusion that, more probably than not, J. Robert Oppenheimer is an agent of the Soviet Union. This was an astonishing charge to level against the man who had led the Manhattan Project, and it was based not on any new evidence, but on a interpretation of Oppenheimer's past associations and his opposition to the hydrogen bomb as evidence of deliberate disloyalty rather than honest disagreement. The Borden letter landed on the desk of President Dwight Eisenhower, who had taken office in January 1953. Eisenhower, though he had profound respect for Oppenheimer's wartime achievements, could not ignore such a serious accusation in the charged atmosphere of the Cold War. In December 1953, Eisenhower ordered that a blank wall be placed between Oppenheimer and all classified information pending a review of his security clearance. Oppenheimer was essentially suspended from any role in government advisory work. His access to the secrets he had helped create suddenly revoked. He was given the option to resign his security clearance quietly, which would have ended his influence but spared him public humiliation. But Oppenheimer, perhaps unwisely, chose to fight, demanding a hearing where he could defend himself against the accusations. The hearing that began in April 1954 was officially described as a personnel security board proceeding to determine whether Oppenheimer's security clearance should be restored. But in practice it was a trial, with Oppenheimer as the defendant and the full weight of the government as the prosecution. The proceedings took place in a temporary building on Capitol Hill, in a small, stuffy room where Oppenheimer and his lawyers faced a three-member panel charged with evaluating his loyalty and trustworthiness. The deck was stacked against him from the beginning. The Atomic Energy Commission's attorney, Roger Robb, had full access to classified information, including FBI surveillance transcripts, while Oppenheimer's lawyers did not. Robb knew what Oppenheimer had said in private conversations. Oppenheimer did not know what evidence would be used against him. It was a fundamentally unfair process, designed more to build a case for denying his clearance than to conduct a genuine inquiry into the facts. Over 4 weeks of testimony, the hearing delved into every aspect of Oppenheimer's life: his political associations in the 1930s, his relationships with communists and former communists, his contacts with Soviet officials during and after the war, his opposition to the hydrogen bomb, his advice on various policy matters, even his personal life and character. Witness after witness was called, some to defend Oppenheimer, others to condemn him. The proceedings revealed a man of immense complexity, brilliant and arrogant, idealistic and naive, principled and sometimes deceitful. a man who had made mistakes and questionable judgments, but who had served his country with dedication and distinction. The most damaging testimony came from Edward Teller, the physicist who had advocated so strongly for the hydrogen bomb and who had been frustrated by Oppenheimer's opposition. When asked whether he thought Oppenheimer was disloyal, Teller carefully avoided making that accusation directly, but he said something that was in many ways worse, testifying that he would feel the country would be safer if security matters were in other hands than Oppenheimer's. It was a devastating statement. A former colleague essentially saying that Oppenheimer could not be trusted with America's secrets. Teller's testimony was motivated partly by genuine disagreement over the hydrogen bomb, partly by personal animosity, and partly by Teller's own conviction that he was serving American interests by removing Oppenheimer's influence. But the effect was to give official sanction to the view that Oppenheimer was a security risk, and the scientific community would never forgive Teller for what many saw as betrayal. Other witnesses testified more favorably, praising Oppenheimer's wartime leadership, his integrity, his contributions to American science and security. General Groves, who had selected Oppenheimer to lead Los Alamos despite knowledge of his left-wing associations, testified that he had never doubted Oppenheimer's loyalty. Many leading scientists spoke in his defense, pointing out that disagreement over policy should not be confused with disloyalty. But the fix was in. The decision had likely been made before the hearing ever began. The security board was looking for reasons to deny Oppenheimer's clearance, and his past provided ample material for those seeking to find him wanting. On May 27, 1954, the Personnel Security Board issued its decision. By a vote of 2-1, they recommended that Oppenheimer's security clearance not be restored. The majority opinion acknowledged his loyalty to the United States, stating explicitly that they did not believe he was disloyal or a security risk in the sense of being likely to betray secrets. But they found that his associations with communists had shown poor judgment, that his opposition to the hydrogen bomb had not been sufficiently enthusiastic once presidential policy had been decided, and that his behavior had exhibited what they called a persistent and willful disregard for the normal and proper obligations of security. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic language, denying his clearance while avoiding the direct accusation of disloyalty that the evidence would not support. The Atomic Energy Commission upheld this decision in June 1954, and J. Robert Oppenheimer's career as a government advisor was over. The man who had been trusted with America's most important scientific project during World War II was now deemed unfit to be trusted with access to classified information. During the Cold War, the decision sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Many leading physicists were outraged, seeing the proceeding as a political witch hunt and the decision as a travesty of justice. Some protested publicly. Others quietly resolved to limit their own cooperation with government weapons programs. The Oppenheimer case became a symbol of how Cold War paranoia could destroy even the most brilliant and accomplished individuals, how political disagreement could be transformed into questions of loyalty, how past associations could be used to punish present dissent. But why had Oppenheimer really become viewed as a threat? The answer is complex and involves multiple factors that converge to destroy his security clearance and his reputation. First, there was his genuine opposition to the hydrogen bomb, which powerful figures interpreted not as honest, scientific and strategic judgment, but as obstructing American interests. In the zero-sum logic of the Cold War, anyone who questioned unlimited weapons development was suspect, and Oppenheimer's opposition to the super became evidence of disloyalty in the eyes of his critics. Second, there were his past associations with communists, which in the 1930s had been unremarkable among intellectuals, but which in the 1950s seemed like proof of dangerous sympathies. Third, there was political revenge. Oppenheimer had made enemies over the years, people like Teller and Lewis Strauss, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, who resented his influence and his intellectual arrogance, and who were willing to use the security process to settle scores. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Oppenheimer had committed what might be called the sin of independence. He had his own views on nuclear policy, views based on his deep understanding of the weapons and their implications. And he was not willing to simply endorse whatever the government wanted to do. He believed that scientists who understood nuclear weapons had a special responsibility to inform policy, to warn about dangers, to push back against policies they thought were misguided. This made him valuable during the war, when his expertise was desperately needed, but it made him threatening during the Cold War, when what the government wanted was compliance and support, rather than independent judgment. A scientist who questioned policy was more dangerous than a scientist who simply built what he was told to build. And Oppenheimer had never been good at being told what to do. The security hearing also revealed deep tensions within the scientific community about the role of scientists. In the nuclear age, some scientists, like Teller, believed their duty was to provide the government with whatever weapons it requested, and to leave policy decisions to political leaders. Others, like Oppenheimer, believed scientists had a responsibility to think about the implications of their work and to offer advice not just on technical feasibility but on strategic wisdom and moral consequences. The Oppenheimer case represented, in many ways, a defeat for the latter view, a message that scientists who wanted to participate in government work needed to keep their opinions within acceptable bounds and not challenge fundamental policy directions. There was also an element of class and cultural resentment in Oppenheimer's downfall. He was an intellectual who quoted poetry, read philosophy, and spoke multiple languages. He could be arrogant and condescending, especially toward those he considered his intellectual inferiors. He moved in elite circles, had a sophisticated aesthetic sensibility, and displayed a kind of cultural refinement that many Americans found off-putting or even suspicious. In the democratic, egalitarian culture of America, particularly in the suspicious atmosphere of the 1950s, this kind of elitism could work against someone. Oppenheimer was too smart, too cultured, too cosmopolitan, and these qualities, which had helped him lead Los Alamos, became liabilities when he was being judged by people who resented or distrusted intellectuals. The consequences of the security hearing extended far beyond Oppenheimer's personal tragedy. The scientific community was shocked and demoralized, with many brilliant minds deciding that government work was too dangerous to pursue if honest disagreement could be punished as disloyalty. The hearing had a chilling effect on scientific advice to the government, as scientists learned that challenging official policy could end their careers. Some historians argue that American science policy suffered for decades because of the lesson of the Oppenheimer case, that independent thinking was dangerous and that scientists should confine themselves to narrow technical questions rather than broader strategic and moral issues. For Oppenheimer personally, the loss of his security clearance was devastating. He remained director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and he continued to teach, write, and think about physics and philosophy. But he was excluded from the classified work that had been central to his identity for over a decade, cut off from the weapons programs he had pioneered and from the policy debates about nuclear strategy that he had helped to frame. He aged visibly after the hearing, his face becoming more drawn, his manner more withdrawn. He never fully recovered from the humiliation and the sense of betrayal, the knowledge that his country had turned on him after he had given it so much. Yet even in defeat, Oppenheimer maintained his dignity and his commitment to speaking about the nuclear age and its dangers. He gave lectures and wrote articles about the relationship between science and society, about the responsibilities of scientists, about the dangers of the arms race he had warned against. In 1963, in a gesture of rehabilitation, President Lyndon Johnson awarded Oppenheimer the Enrico Fermi Award, the Atomic Energy Commission's highest honor. It was a public acknowledgement that the treatment he had received had been unjust, though his security clearance was never restored. Edward Teller, who presented one of the awards that day, attempted to shake Oppenheimer's hand, but many in the audience turned their backs on Teller, a silent statement of where the scientific community's sympathies lay. Looking back from the perspective of decades later, the question of why Oppenheimer became viewed as a threat during the Cold War reveals uncomfortable truths about American society in the 1950s. He became a threat not because he was disloyal or because he betrayed secrets, but because he represented a kind of independent thinking that Cold War America found intolerable. He challenged the assumption that more weapons always meant more security. He questioned whether unlimited technological development served human welfare. He maintained relationships and associations that, while innocent in their context, could be twisted into evidence of suspect loyalties. He refused to simply endorse whatever policy the government adopted, insisting on his right and responsibility to offer independent judgment based on his expertise and values. The real tragedy of the Oppenheimer case is not just what happened to one brilliant scientist, but what it revealed about how fear can corrupt institutions and destroy individuals who don't conform to prevailing orthodoxies. Oppenheimer became a threat because the Cold War created an environment where any dissent from official policy could be interpreted as disloyalty, where past associations could be weaponized against present reputation, where the complexity of human life and thought could be reduced to simple questions of loyalty and betrayal. He was a casualty of the very arms race he had warned against, destroyed not by nuclear weapons, but by the political and psychological climate that those weapons helped create. In the end, history has been kinder to Oppenheimer than his contemporaries were. Most historians now view the security hearing as a grave injustice, a political persecution masquerading as a legitimate security proceeding. His warnings about the dangers of the nuclear arms race have been vindicated by decades of living under the shadow of potential annihilation. His vision of scientists as having responsibilities beyond simply building whatever weapons are requested has been embraced by many in the scientific community. The hydrogen bomb he opposed was built, and both the United States and Soviet Union eventually possessed thousands of thermonuclear weapons, but the security they provided proved illusory, and the wisdom of his caution became increasingly apparent as the Cold War progressed. Robert Oppenheimer died in 1967, his reputation partially restored but never fully rehabilitated in his lifetime. He remained a figure of controversy, celebrated by some as a martyr to Cold War hysteria, condemned by others as someone who had indeed shown poor judgment, and whose opposition to the hydrogen bomb had been dangerously misguided. But regardless of one's view of his specific positions and choices, the story of how he became viewed as a threat to America remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing fear and political pressure to override fairness, judgment, and the recognition that disagreement is not the same as disloyalty. The question of why Oppenheimer became a threat to America during the Cold War thus has multiple answers, all of them revealing something important about that era and its anxieties. He became a threat because he opposed the hydrogen bomb, because he had associated with communists in the 1930s, because he made powerful enemies, because he refused to simply endorse government policy without question, because he represented a model of scientific responsibility that challenged the emerging military-industrial complex, because Cold War paranoia created an environment where any deviation from orthodoxy was suspect, and because his very brilliance and influence made him a target for those who disagreed with him or resented his prominence. None of these reasons justified what was done to him, but together they explain how the hero of 1945 became the suspect of 1954, how America's most important scientist during World War II became a man whose loyalty was questioned and whose security clearance was revoked during the Cold War that followed. The legacy of that transformation continues to resonate every time scientists struggle with questions about their responsibility for the technologies they create, every time government officials must decide how to balance security concerns with fairness and due process, every time we confront the tension between independent thought and institutional loyalty. We are living with the inheritance of the Oppenheimer case. His story reminds us that the greatest threats to a democracy often come not from external enemies, but from internal fears that lead us to betray our own values, to persecute our own citizens, to silence voices that challenge us to think more deeply about the implications of our choices. Robert Oppenheimer became a threat to America not because of what he did, but because of what he represented: the complexity of human loyalty, the importance of independent thought, and the terrible burden of knowledge in an age when science had given humanity the power to destroy itself.